Okay. Welcome, Chris.
Brilliant. Thanks, Arlene. Can everybody see my presentation? Arlene, just nod your head if you can see it and hear me.
See it. Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
nodding. Brilliant. Okay. Well, this is wonderful to be asked to present this on this topic of critical gerontology, which has been, of course, an important issue for me over a very long period of time. And what I thought I'd do is just give some background to critical gerontology, give a definition, and identify what I think are the key themes. Talk about three streams, which I think figured in critical gerontology: political economy, work in the humanities, and cultural gerontology. I then want to summarize that in terms of what I think of three phases of aging, which you may or may not find plausible. And then kind of move the debate on to this idea of precarious aging, some of the methodological challenges, and then a couple of slides looking ahead. Okay, so I hope that sounds all right. I hope that fits the bill. Let me just give a bit of background in terms of, I suppose, influences first on me. I actually worked in a psychiatric hospital in the late 1960s as a community volunteer. This was a huge hospital of 800 beds in the countryside. A very, very grim place, actually. And if you know Goffman's book, Asylums, was a classic front and back wards, where in the back wards, there were patients who, mainly older people, who'd been there for 30, 40 years. It was a huge shock, I think, to myself, relatively young and certainly very inexperienced. It did get me, have a lasting influence, though. It did get me very interested in the field of anti-psychiatry, which had started to emerge, and critical psychiatry, which had started to emerge, excuse me, in the late 1960s, early 70s, with R.D. Laing and so on. But I then subsequently, when I became a student, doing a degree in Birmingham in the 1970s, early 1970s, worked in a geriatric hospital, again as a volunteer, and again shocking kind of conditions in the hospital, a warehousing of people who didn't really need to be there, but they had no other support, and in some cases were had come from very poor housing and so on. And again, I think both of those experiences, and we all have these personal experiences, I think, which to some extent bring us into the field, were influential to me. But I suppose also then the approach I started to take was driven and influenced a lot by Marxist perspectives, and indeed first wave feminism, and certainly Marxism was very important, as it still is to me in the 1970s, reinforced undoubtedly by the economic crisis of the 1970s and 1980s. And undoubtedly, if you read, about the background to critical gerontology, it was the economic crisis in terms of cuts to welfare, massive redundancies in mining, shipbuilding, and steel, really crisis in manufacturing industry in many countries, the UK in particular, alongside, of course, the rise of neoliberalism, Reagan, Thatcher, and the crisis in the welfare state. So all these things kind of came together, I think influenced those of us who'd started to work on issues about aging. And by the end of the in the mid-1970s, I started doing a PhD on people's experience of retirement and going into a department, again, which was strong in terms of political economy and Marxism, amongst other areas. The other thing I should just mention, I think in the certainly influencing me, was some politicization in the 70s and early 80s of pensioner groups. And in America, there was the rise of the Grey Panthers, led by Maggie Kuhn. Maggie Kuhn was a very interesting figure who'd been a Presbyterian church minister who'd been compulsorily retired and became very agitated about that, along with the Vietnam War. And she developed the Grey Panthers, led the Grey Panthers movement, very much as an intergenerational movement, campaigning for justice on behalf of younger and older people, but particularly in the context of the Vietnam War, which of course was a big thing in terms of the politicization of many of us in the 1970s. So that's a bit of background, which may or may not be of interest or of help. So in terms of I can't seem to. Right, okay. And just in terms of definitions of critical gerontology, I think two helpful ones. Possibly, I with Alan Walker came up with this one in the late 1970s, that we saw critical gerontology as a more value-committed approach, a commitment not just to understand the social construction of aging, but to change it. And Jan Baars came up with, I think, quite an interesting definition, a collection of questions, problems, and analyses that have been excluded by the established mainstream. Quite an interesting idea there, that a lot of the ideas that we deal with in aging are part of a mainstream, but there are other ideas that we don't think about that appear to have been excluded in some way. So I think critical gerontology develops, particularly in the 80s and 90s, and I think it's best seen as a reaction to what many of us felt was the individualistic focus of gerontology, particularly through things like role theory, disengagement theory, symbolic interactionism. I mean, these were theories which were interesting in many ways, were telling us important things about growing old, but they weren't engaging with the way that society influenced later life, had an impact on later life, transformed later life in so many ways. So Carol Estes, I think, came in on this. Carol, I think, was really the first in her wonderful book, The Aging Enterprise, which is still well worth reading. With this argument, old age should be seen as part of a social construction shaped by social attitudes and expectations, political and economic structures, and cultural beliefs and associations. I mean, that's interesting actually to look at that quote, which I've extracted from The Aging Enterprise, in the sense that I don't think, the social construction idea wasn't a kind of highly Marxist, deterministic model in many ways. It allowed for these other areas like cultural beliefs and so on. And I think that's kind of an important point. Then I think some of the books that works that I'd argue were important in this period, I think. The Aging Enterprise, certainly one. The Aging Enterprise was a study of the Older Americans Act, which had been passed in the mid-60s. And Carroll's point was that the Act, really, which was designed to serve older people, had been hijacked by professionals who, who were working in their own interests. They weren't really working in the interests of older people. And in a way, that was also true of the argument of Alan Walker in I think, a terrific essay, The Social Creation of Dependency, in the Journal of Social Policy, where he kind of brought together the different forces in the welfare state, UK welfare state, obviously, which actually, created dependency. They didn't create autonomy or independency. And Peter Townsend came in a year after with this notion of the structured dependency of older people. Sorry, I've got a problem with my internet. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
I think you might need to restart the presentation.
Yeah, okay. Are we back on?
Yes,
yeah.
We're back.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, okay, sorry about that. So, Townsend came in with his paper on the structural dependency of older people. And the structural dependency was an interaction between what he saw as the imposition of retirement on the one side and passive community care on the other. He used this phrase, passive community care, which I think was a very interesting one. Analogous really to the way Carol Estes was arguing about the operation of the Older Americans Act. I weighed in a book with the catchy title, Capitalism and the Construction of Old Age, on the idea of, older people as a reserve army of labor, that capitalism viewed older workers as important, in some periods when there was a demand for labor, and then in periods of crisis and when industry was in crisis, push them out as quickly as possible. And I think that thesis has been demonstrated, if you like, over successive periods. Then I think Dale Danifer's very influential essay, Cumulative Advantage and Disadvantage. And he was, I think, one of the first to link inequality as a life course issue, something you accumulate advantage over the life course if you come from certain backgrounds, but equally you accumulate disadvantage over the life course if you accumulate. It's the Matthews effect, if you like. And I think that's been a terrifically influential essay in terms of how we viewed inequality in later life as not something which hits people at the age of 60, but something that's been gathering pace through their life. And I think that's true whether it's income, health, or other issues. And then there was a kind of discussion which started to happen from around, I suppose, 2010, or a bit earlier, perhaps, about globalisation, and that's kind of gathered force, I think, in terms of the relationship between globalisation and issues affecting older people. And then the debate about precarity and critical gerontology, and I'll come on to that later. One strand which I do think is important, which I would just like to kind of highlight, again, a terrific essay by Carol Estes and Elizabeth Binney, which many of you will know, I think, the biomedicalization of aging. Because an important strand of Carol's work, which she introduced us to,
okay, have we lost Chris fully? Chris, you're back. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm back. I'm sorry about this. It's
maybe
my terrible.
Do you
here we go. I'm back.
Do you think, Chris, do you think it helps if I screen share and you just talk and tell me when to change slide?
All right. Okay. Why don't you do that? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Do you want me to come out then and use screen share?
Yes.
Let's keep going for a bit. Let's keep going for a bit.
Okay. Up to you, Chris.
Yeah, let's keep going. Okay. Yes, I think what was important, again, Karen introduced us to this notion that it wasn't just, structural inequalities which are affecting the lives of older people, but also the way that aging was influenced by what she saw as the dominance of the biomedical establishment, and the way we tended to see as a result of that behaviors and policies which saw aging as a medical problem, and it becoming what they saw in this essay in an important phrase, I think, biomedicine becoming the kind of institutionalized thought structure of the field, marginalizing the way in which we see the importance of social and behavioral factors. I think that was a very important insight. And I mean, it's one we accept, of course, now. I mean, I would say it's become even more important.
Okay, I think we will wait for Chris to return, and then I should share the slides. Chris?
Okay, why don't you put yours on, Ireland? Yeah, okay.
And I think maybe it also helps if you turn off your camera. That might help too.
Oh, that might help. Yeah, okay. Okay.
Tell me when to switch slides, and then I think we should hopefully get a bit more bandwidth.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to. All right. I've stopped my camera now, but I've still got my.
We can hear you.
Hang
Yeah.
on. Yeah. Okay. Have you got You've got my slides on, have you?
Yes. Can you see the slides?
Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay.
Let's tell me when to go to the next one.
Yes. Okay. So I think I'm sorry about this, everyone. It's problem with internet. So I think this was an important perception about the importance of biomedicalization, which I think became important, especially during COVID-19 pandemic, when in a sense the strength of biomedicine was greatly influenced and strengthened by kind of biomedical perspectives. Okay, next slide. So I think there have been three strands in political economy, and three strands in critical perspectives: political economy, humanities, and cultural gerontology, or cultural critical gerontology. So if I go to the next slide, Ireland. So I think political economy, I think, was the first strand, if you like, in critical gerontology. And here you had Alan Walker, Peter Townsend, Carol Estes, and others who were challenging the idea of older people as a homogenous group in society, unaffected by dominant structures and ideologies. And of course, this political economy perspective was developing in the context of a crisis in the welfare state, huge upheavals in terms of the economy, and a shift to the right in terms of political ideology. So I think you have to see the political economy perspective emerging in terms of that background, and introducing a whole set of issues in terms of class, gender, and ethnicity. Particularly, I would argue, I think, in terms of the importance of gender and ethnicity. Class, very important as well, but I think still often under-theorized in terms of political economy perspectives. Finally, I think important in political economy was this argument about the importance of understanding the role of the state in terms of influencing the construction of old age, influencing the distribution of resources, influencing the nature of ideology in later life. And, all of those things, I think, became very important in this perspective. Okay, next slide, Arnold. Running alongside political economy, and this was especially the case in the United States, was critical perspectives coming from the humanities, particularly from people rooted in philosophy and medical ethics. And the two figures here that I would single out are Harry Moody and Thomas Cole. Moody wrote, I think, a really wonderful book called The Abundance of Life, which was essentially trying to explore the range of resources which older people need to have a flourishing life. But he attacked social gerontology at the time, in the 1980s, arguing that it was turning itself into what he called instrumental gerontology, a form of rationality that was denying the way in which growing old was also human and a subjective experience, one which he argued, I think, perhaps on occasions that people in political economy tended to lose sight of. And then the other figure, I think, who was also very important was Thomas Cole, who wrote, again, a fantastic book called The Journey of Life, A Cultural History of Aging, and where he argued that we must acknowledge that our great progress in the material and physical conditions of life have been achieved at a high spiritual and ethical price, and that older people continue to occupy what he saw as an inferior status in an economy and culture committed to the management of growth without limit. And Cole co-edited a series of books on the Handbook of Humanities and Aging, which are well worth looking at. There's a new one that was just published this year, actually. Okay, next slide, please. So I think final strand, I would argue, in critical gerontology in this quick tour is this move to a cultural gerontology, which Julia Twigg and Wendy Martin introduced with their handbook. And what you have here, I think, is to some extent a shift from the kind of concern with structure in political economy to one with trying to understand what does agency mean in the context of aging and aging societies? What do we understand by subjectivity and reflexivity? And, to some extent, I think thinking about how do we need to rethink the idea of aging in the context of a world where there's much more fluidity and instability. So it's really asking us to critically question many of the basic categories which we're using in later life, and which to some extent, I think, critical gerontology, as it started, didn't perhaps look at in quite the way that we should have been doing. Okay, next slide. So now I think there is, if you like, a new political economy of aging. We've got a drive to raise pension ages, a shift from, in the global north, of course, in countries in the global north, from early to late exit from the workplace, or an attempt to do that, the abandonment of the social or welfare state, and an attempt to argue that we have a return to intergenerational conflict with a kind of worker versus pensioner debate, which has arisen post-COVID, illustrated by the arguments about pensions in the UK, but in other countries as well. So next slide. So I think it's helpful to see us going through three phases, perhaps, that have been operating over the second half of the 20th century into the 21st. Firstly, a kind of welfare state aging in the global north, where we had mandatory retirement, the evolution of state pensions, occupational benefits, and a generational consensus that those arrangements were appropriate. Then secondly, of course, a period of active aging. And this is interesting, isn't it? I mean, if we've been having this discussion, 3 or 4 years ago, it'd been full of active aging, which was promulgated by the World Health Organization and other bodies, which was promoting extended working, unpaid productive activities, and saying that, people can live healthy, independent lives, and the more activity that we have, the better. Then I think now we've kind of gone into a new period, which I would call precarious aging, for want of a better term, where, in contrast to earlier periods, we've got collapse of secure labour markets, a widening of inequalities, cohorts between and within cohorts, I think, and certainly a weakening of rights to social protection. Next slide, please. So I suppose the question that we've been wrestling with, a number of us, is precariousness rather than activity the new form of aging? Next slide. And I came up, this is the definition that in our book on this we came up with, the concept draws attention to insecurities, unwanted risks, and costly hazards of contemporary life, resulting from globalisation, neoliberalisation, and declining social protection. Next slide. And I came up with this idea some time ago that, if you recall, there were indicators of activity. And I came up with this idea where you could have indicators of precariousness. Though I never followed through this idea. So if anybody wants to pursue it and write a paper on indicators, developing these, they're absolutely welcome. But it seemed to me you could summarize it in terms of, more precarious work and retirement transitions, more precarious environments, particularly with the impact of climate change, which, of course, when critical gerontology started, we didn't talk about climate change or spatial injustice in cities, precarious resources, and what we might call a precarious deep old age, the sort of thing that Amanda Grenier talks about in terms of the impact of labels associated with frailty and dementia. But I think there's an argument there that there are these indicators, which I think are more meaningful than the old indicators of activity, which we had before. Okay, next slide. So I think, to some extent, these ideas about precariousness were very much drawn from Standing's work on labour, where he argued about flexible labour relations, creating new uncertainties. But I've also been interested in the idea of older people being caught in what we might call a precarity trap, forced to remain or re-enter the workforce. And we've seen the rise in 0 hours working amongst people 50 plus in the UK. Office of National Statistics have brought out some very interesting data on that. But also people relying on precarious workers as carers. I think, there's another dynamic there as well. So I think there's lots to bring out there. Okay, next slide, Arlene. You're doing brilliantly on this. So what's the implications of this approach from a critical perspective? I think it helps move us away. Gerontology helps move us away from individualized or stage-based frameworks rooted in activity and success. I think that's one merit of it. Perhaps also it reminds us of precariousness as something where there's a shared vulnerability, as well as a desire for control. and that we need to think about issues of dependency, interdependence, and human suffering in this approach. This is my big argument against the kind of activity theory, third age, fourth age, because they undermine thinking about the shared issues we face in an aging society. Anyway, next slide. So, methodological challenges. I've got 4 challenges here. I just want to go through quickly and then come to a conclusion, and then hope we'll have time for discussion. Good. Okay, so I think if you take this idea of precariousness, I think there's some interesting methodological issues. Firstly, Ireland. Okay, next slide. So I think one question that I've been thinking about a lot is how you study more precarious lives which are going through the life course now. A rise in the number of homeless people, refugees, those living in extreme or deep poverty, people lacking or with contested citizenship, those living outside the system. Well, when we go to conferences, we don't hear much about the way these people are growing old. And I think we perhaps need to develop new methodologies here. There are some really interesting books around. Venkatesh, in a book published some years ago, Gang Leader for a Day, embedded himself in a very rough estate in North America and explored the kind of networks of disenfranchised people. Desmond's book Evicted is a very interesting study of Afro-Americans evicted from their homes, and again his use of research techniques there I think is very interesting. And Amanda Gronier's more recent book on homelessness, again, I think a very exemplary use of different types of techniques to interview people in hostels, on the streets, and so on. But my question is, do we need new methodologies to explore a more fractured, fragmented aging population and to capture groups who are often not caught in formal surveys? That's a question perhaps to talk about. And then next slide, Arlen. Yes, precarious ethnicities. One of the studies I did some years ago with colleagues was a study where we interviewed 100 women who'd migrated from areas in Bangladesh and settled in London. And one of the kind of things that struck me about that was the way their life courses were so different from the life courses of people I interviewed, in other studies. Life courses which were very much disrupted by different events, where they experienced a lot of events in a different sequence than we're used to, a disorderly sequence, if you like. And this idea of people experiencing disruption, discontinuity, and turbulence in terms of the way migration is experienced, I think is a very important issue, and the way that affects their identity later on in life. But I think this does lead to a lot of questions about trying to understand better the impact of racism over the life course, mainstreaming ethnicity research in social gerontology, understanding what people call hybrid identities. You're neither one nor the other, but a bit of both. And how does that affect how you experience later life? I think really some important questions there. Okay, next slide. And then we've got this issue or this distinction, which I think has bedeviled a lot of work in gerontology between the third and the fourth age, and the equation of agency with the third age and decline with the fourth. and frailty as a form of fate following a period of active aging, with those becoming frail, potentially becoming a marginalized group in society. And this is something that Amanda Grenier, I think, has explored in a number of essays. So I think there's an important set of questions here about how we conceptualize agency in the context of the so-called fourth age. To what extent do expressions of agency differ from other periods? I mean, they may differ, but it's still a form of agency, which we see with people. But new theories and methods might be required to understand the extent to which that might be the case. And then finally, in terms of methodology, Arlind, if we can have the next slide. I think there is this big debate we're now having, inspired by researchers like my colleague Tina Buffel, on doing co-research. And maybe co-research, co-production is an important way of working through some of the challenges of interviewing people living marginalized lives in low-income communities, trying to develop a partnership with people, training people to co-design, develop and deliver research. But I think, as Tina would be the first to say, these are really very challenging things to do. They're not easy to do. And so I think, being realistic about what can be achieved, particularly if you're working in hard to reach communities, hard to reach groups, is important. Okay, a couple more slides, and then we'll hopefully, well, 3 more slides, actually. Okay. Challenges ahead. I think there are 3 big ones from a critical gerontology perspective. Population aging in the global north is running alongside the erosion of collective institutions. And Walter Streeck, a German political economist, talked about the under-institutionalized society. I think that's an extremely good phrase. We're entering aging populations, but an under-institutionalized world. So the institutions to support those populations are being weakened. And in a way, I think Beck's concept of the risk society, which came in the 1990s, is still quite a good one. I mean, he was pointing to the way in which the more wealth you have in society, the more exposure to different forms of risk. And he would have seen he died a couple of years ago, but he would have seen the pandemic as an illustration of a risk-based society. And finally, of course, you've got the decline of what we call as the social commons, with the privatization of physical and social infrastructure, libraries, community centres, day centres, and so on. So I think those are 3 big challenges. But before we get terribly gloomy, I've got 2 more slides to finish. So I think 3 strands for future gerontological work, which I think, it'd be great if ERA can be part of this work. First, I think it's about how can we renew critical gerontology, drawing together a new political economy in the context of very different settings from the 70s and 80s and 90s. But also, I think, bringing in the humanities. I think bringing in the way that the humanities ask us to address questions about meaning, about culture, about what it is to be alive as an 80-year-old, as a 90-year-old, in the context of a capitalist commodified society. Those are really important questions. And of course, they must be part of a public gerontology about how we translate our research findings to different audiences. But I think with a focus, for me, on those least advantaged and who experience aging as an additional dimension of inequality. This is what we have to constantly argue and address. Part of that, I think, can be this idea of community gerontology. There's a very good paper by Emily Greenfield and colleagues in the Gerontologist a couple of years ago. So we can see our local community as a context of aging and the basis for exerting change. So community-based work of some sort, I think, is important. And finally, yeah, so I think there are, in terms of gerontology practice, for me, and this is an absolutely personal view, which I'm sure won't be shared necessarily by the 39 other people on the call, but I mean, a relentless focus on low-income communities for whom aging is still a matter of disbelief. You don't believe you're going to grow old because of the circumstances in which you live. Jan Barnes has just produced a book, Long Lives Are for the Rich, where he kind of looks at all the data on this in terms of health inequalities. We do need to focus on socially excluding language, which did become toxic in the COVID-19 crisis, and the way in which in countries such as the UK, concepts like frailty were used to kind of screen off very elderly people from getting necessary hospital care. And of course, we need to bring back residential nursing home care into the mainstream of gerontological research. Joelis has called what happened in residential care in European countries and in North America as a form of eldercide, where a huge number of people died unnecessarily in terrible circumstances. And we mustn't forget what happened, and we must address how we can transform that particular sector through our research. I think that is very important. So I'll end. That's it. There are a lot of references, although I've missed out a couple, so I'll pick them up. Okay.
I'll just stop the recording.